All right, I will now call this City Council work session meeting to order. First thing I'm going to do is call on Claudia, our city recorder.
Yes, before we start, I do want to state for the record that we received 2 emails from community members regarding tonight's topic. I have sent those emails on to the council, and they will be made part of the amended packet for the record.
Thank you, Claudia. Now I'd like to call on Geoff Hunsaker and Public Works, and I see we also have James Lofton, our city engineer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So this evening, you're not going to have to just listen to me talk. We got a bit of our Stormwater Dream Team here. James is joining me, who's been a part of the process, and then we have 2 of our consultants online, Christina Conchilla with Raftelis and Deb Glardy with Glardy Rothstein Group, who helped us with the development of the stormwater fee.
Good, Jeff. Could you pull the mic a little closer?
Never know how, that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
All right, just inhale the thing. All right. There we go. All right, so tonight's agenda, rehash the communities and values and missions that why we're here tonight and why we've been looking at the stormwater utility fee over the last couple of years. Then James is going to go a little bit over why a stormwater utility fund and how it works, and kind of reiterate some of the information that we shared in the regulatory work session we had back in December, and the work session we had on the state of the infrastructure a couple months ago. Just a quick review of that. Then we're going to go over all the PAC recommendations that the PAC put together over their time together. Then our consultants are going to help us go over the rate development and how that worked, and then we'll talk next steps. So again, this work started a couple years ago. The reason being, from the policy side, that we have the city mission of delivering high quality services. One of our values is stewardship and our responsibility to be caretakers of our shared public assets and resources. And then also making sure we meet the goal of creating and implementing an environmentally sustainable plan.
Why a stormwater utility fund? We've talked about this in the past, and it kind of boils down to really we already have stormwater utility infrastructure, and why we're looking at this as a way to pay for the maintenance of that. It kind of, as you look at the project, as we looked at the costs associated with proactively maintaining this whole system, it kind of boiled into kind of 2 groups here. The cost of deferred maintenance over the last 100 years is getting to a point where it's pretty high. Current operations are more reactionary in maintenance. We don't have a proactive maintenance plan, so that deferred maintenance is about 75% of the cost. And then we also have current regulatory requirements. And so we just, to put it in perspective, and we'll touch on both of these a little more later, just wanted to kind of show that up front. We have some limitations with our system. Lack of sufficient sustainable resources is pretty big. You can see on the left, I threw on a couple of photos. The operation of the stormwater system is limited. The rehabilitation and replacement of the infrastructure is not really happening, only when it's failed or we have an event like you see on the left is a sinkhole in the lower picture. When that failed, then we went out there and replaced it, but it's not a I would say a proactive replacement program. It's also tough with an ever expanding regulatory environment to keep up with essentially unfunded mandates coming down the line. And so we have definitely some limitations. Another issue is inequitable funding. Currently, the city does not fund in a way that fairly allocates the costs. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not too late. There's still an opportunity here to consider the stormwater utility to try to get ahead of some of this before there's substantial failures. With that, a stormwater utility fund, or to go along with is also referred to as an enterprise fund, has some real benefits, or some, I would say, strengths. It provides a equitable distribution of those costs. It's a system, what's broadly used in Oregon is for establishing stormwater utility. It's basing it on the demand, and the main demand feature for stormwater is how much impervious surface you have on your property. That is a direct correlation to how much loading the system receives. The more impervious surface, the more runoff you have. Establishing a utility fund based on that is a more equitable way of spreading those costs. Big benefit here is it reduces the demand on the general and street funds. This has been talked about elsewhere, but there's issues with the general fund and there's constraints with tax, the gas tax. So both those funds are already strained. This reduces the demand on those. It provides a stable, sustainable funding mechanism. This tied as a utility on everyone's utility bill. It's something that's much more sustainable. The city has this responsibility to maintain the infrastructure indefinitely. And so with that, you need a sustainable funding source to manage that responsibility. It improves the safety of our community. We currently have a project, actually it's out to bid right now, where we get to do a stormwater improvement. And that was funded with ARPA funds, kind of once in a lifetime dollars. Establishing a utility fund, we could have more of those projects where you're proactively going in there to help mitigate flood risks. It also definitely goes towards meeting council's goals of protecting waterways and pollutants in an environmentally safe manner.
All right. So with that, we'll get into the recommendations of the PAC. So the PAC was a group of, we had 11 members. Councilor Geary was our council liaison for that. We had 5 residential customers that were on the PAC. We also had a couple commercial customers from Heater Allen Brewing and Dean Klaus Construction. We had a representative from Cascade Steel who represented industrial customers. We had 3 institutional, McWater and Light, the school district, and Infield. And then we had 1 from the development community with Integrity Builders. So that committee worked together, had multiple meetings, 6 in total. And the overall recommendation was for the city council to adopt a stormwater utility fee to fund stormwater expenses more equitably. That recommendation was adopted unanimously by the PAC. There wasn't a 11-2 or anything like that. It was a full. Oh. A little closer. There
Or
we
just
go.
angle it up a little bit.
Sorry.
All right. That better? Okay. All right. So restating that, the overall committee recommendation was to adopt a stormwater utility fee, and that recommendation was unanimous among all the PAC members. So as we start going through some of these recommendations, before I move on to the next slide, I'm going to pause to make sure that there's no questions or comments about any of these specifics, since it's a work session and you all might have questions on that.
I'm thinking maybe, do you have anything right now, or do we want to go a little further with?
I had a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So inside of the slides and all of the literature, we keep seeing the word equity or an equitable. It's a really hot topic right now, and it's very exciting to use for some folks. But the thing is, I don't know how it's being applied here. What does equitable mean with stormwater?
So for stormwater, it's basically you're paying for the usage based on your impact of the system. So we have some equity stuff in it. I guess it would be closer to equality for that one a little bit, but we do have some equitable points in there. But generally, right now, if we're funding it with general fund, that's based on the value of your property, mostly with your property taxes. There's other revenue sources in the general fund, but that doesn't correlate with your usage of the stormwater system. Same thing with the street gas tax. just because you're buying gas doesn't mean you're necessarily impacting the stormwater system. So when we use it, the terminology, we mean people are paying for it based on their impact to the system specifically, and not other revenue sources that are based on different impacts. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I thought that's how you were using it, but there's a lot of different ways to use that word right now. And if I may ask one more question, the commercial and industrial folks that were represented on the PAC, they also found the proposed fees to be equitable for those customers as well, I presume?
Yes.
Yes.
They did.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay.
So let me ask a question. So it may be the same answer, it might be the same question, just in a different way. But you said that we're not fairly allocating costs. Is that the same answer? That it's because we're not getting the same amount of money from each person?
Yes, essentially, not that it's not the same amount of money, but it's the money isn't related to their impact on the system. So like in wastewater, you're paying your rate based on the amount of sewage that's coming out of your home. With your water bill, you're paying for the amount of water you're using. Those are other enterprise funds. And then the standard that's been used in the state of Oregon has been impervious surface area, or the amount of hard surface you have on your property, and basing your impact on the storm system on that. So the home and the driveway.
And then you said that there's funds coming out of the street fund, but then also out of the general fund. What's being paid out of the general fund currently?
Currently, general fund partly pays for a little bit of the engineering resources that we need to go through the regulatory requirements. And then if there is ever stormwater repairs needed outside of the right-of-way, the only funding source we can use for that is the general fund, because state gas tax has a requirement in the state constitution that it can only be spent on the roadways in the right-of-way. So if we have a pipe that's running across a piece of private property, or like through a park, we can't fix it with gas tax dollars, and the only revenue source we would have at that point would be general fund. That hasn't come up too much yet, but we fear that it's going to be coming up more often as the system ages.
Yeah, the photo shown earlier was a sinkhole that opened up outside the right-of-way.
Okay.
So that was a scenario where it would have been general fund to pay for it.
About how much money do you think came out of the general fund for stormwater purposes in this fiscal year?
This fiscal, we budgeted 100,000, and I don't think we've spent all of that yet. I want to say we've spent 25 to 50,000. I don't know that number. I can get it.
That's close enough. I mean, I was just trying to get an idea of what we had to do.
Yeah, and some of that is for the staff costs associated with the annual reporting for the TMDL, which we have not done yet. So we're expecting some of that to come later.
Okay. I had a couple more questions, sorry. I just write them down as I think about them.
Yeah.
And you said on there to meet mandates. So we have some mandates right now,
Yep.
but I know there's other ones that may be coming. And am I correct that that's based on population?
It is, yeah.
And what's the population that would take us into
So-
the next?
It's not just population of McMinnville, but it's population of the urbanized area,
Okay.
which is 50,000. And the urbanized area around McMinnville is very close to that. That being said, EPA and DEQ reserve the right to administer MS4 permit, which would be that next one, at any time of their choosing. And I've literally already been told by them that McMinnville is the next one on the list. We're the largest populated area that does not have that permit yet.
Yeah.
So,
It's our understanding that they're going to be applying the MS4 permit to any municipality over 10,000 for the
Yeah.
next Phase 2 general permit.
Wow, that's going to be a lot of areas.
yeah.
Yes.
And when that happens, we don't know yet. There's some chaos happening up there in the government, but it could very well happen. I think it would be reasonable to expect it within the next 2 to 5 years.
That's all I have right now. Thanks.
Okay. So Then on this slide, we have some of the revenue recommendations. So the committee recommended to begin with a revenue at a minimum service level, and then moving into an interim level after 3 years. Now, we'll get into the specific dollar amounts a little bit more when we get into the rate development and what is in those numbers, but essentially the minimum service level is a starting level of $2 million a year, and we get to that interim level, which is approximately $4 million a year after that 3-year phase-in. At that time, we would hope to be done with the stormwater master plan, and then we can reevaluate if the rate is the correct amount at that time. The committee also recommends the stormwater utility build a minimum fund balance for emergencies, so essentially having a 3-month operating balance, and that to be, again, built over a 3-year period. So not funding it to the 3-month operating all at once, but we'd get a month a year, basically.
Question.
Yeah.
3 months operating expenses. How much is that?
I have that number. I can look that up. 1 minute.
And then from a risk management standpoint, the committee also recommended that the expenses required to meet all the water quality regulatory requirements be fully funded. That aligned with community values and would avoid any potential third-party litigation or penalties.
And do you expect to do that within that 3 years as well, or would that be quicker?
We would meet our regulatory requirements at the beginning of that time.
Mayor, may I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
You've used the phrase to be fully funded to meet community values. Which community values are we talking toward?
The ones I mentioned at the top of the meeting, specifically the stewardship value, which was to be responsible caretakers of our infrastructure.
All right, thanks. I didn't know if that had changed or where it was like MacTown 2032.
Yeah, that's from MacTown 2032.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? James is going to keep looking for that number. We'll make
Okay,
sure to
that's
get to you
fine.
when we
Totally
get to
fine.
that, when he gets it.
Yep.
All right, so there's a couple policy recommendations here from the committee. So our utilities pay our franchise fees. Our wastewater fund pays a franchise fee, the 6%. And the committee recommended that the franchise fee be deferred for 3 years. And so the stormwater utility could build up its fund reserves, and then after the 3 years, begin paying the franchise fee. There was also a recommendation from the committee to consider a dedicated transfer to the street fund. I will say that that is a much larger discussion with the city manager, the finance director, and all that. What we do with our franchise fees, they are just general fund revenue at that point. So the committee did say to consider it, but that is a larger discussion beyond the stormwater utility.
I have a question about the franchise fee. So franchise fee, in my understanding, is usually when someone, a utility, is putting their pipes or their lines underneath our property.
Yep.
But we're doing it under our own property, so why are we paying ourselves a franchise fee?
We do it because the utilities that we have that impact the right-of-way also have to would cover their share of the administration of that right-of-way. So, for example, James and how he permits right-of-way usage and impacts the street fund that way.
And this is consistent with wastewater as well. When we're reviewing permits that come in and people want to go and build something in the right of way, there's a cost associated with always checking those proposed improvements against what's there. So that's why some of those existing utilities would pay that fee. And I do have that number for the reserve. What was assumed was 250 for the first year. Try to get it up higher due to a lot of the deferred maintenance, and then 150,000 on subsequent years. So by the end of the 3 years, you'd have 650. But we had built into the financial plan to continue to add to that. Because I would anticipate we would also dip into that contingency for some substantial projects along the way. And that was a way of accounting for that.
So 650,000 is what you're,
Yeah, at the end of the third year.
okay.
Yep.
Let's go back to the franchise. I'm sorry.
No, that's
I just
fine.
need to understand this. So 3% or 6%?
6%.
6%. So if we have a stormwater fee and a citizen's paying the stormwater fee, 6% of the fee that they're paying is going to go to the general fund.
Correct.
Okay. And so, and is that allocated separately in the general fund and only used for things related to what you do in stormwater, or is it just go to operating the city?
It just goes to the general fund revenues. It doesn't specifically
I know.
get allocated to any specific area in the general fund.
Thank you.
But that was kind of what you were talking about, is that's a potentiality of using that towards the street fund specifically.
Yes, that was a considered dedicated, the committee wanted the council to consider doing a dedicated transfer. It is general fund revenue. Ultimately, council has the decision on how to spend general fund dollars. And so you can choose to do that. You can choose to leave it as just revenue, and you can choose every year. That's a much like I said, it's a much larger decision. We wanted to share that the committee did recommend that consideration, but how to spend the franchise fee dollars and general fund revenues is a much larger discussion than this.
Sure. I just wanna
I
make
would
sure.
definitely want at least the finance director here.
Yes.
As
I just
well.
want to make sure I understand how it got there. And- Go ahead.
And I'll just share on the stormwater paying a franchise fee to the city for this. It was during that PAC discussion, sort of like a, what? And it was that, which is why you have the sort of the defer putting that in until we sort of build this system up so that all those dollars are going into outlying the funds and the health of the system, like James was talking about with the building up the reserves. But ultimately, I think it was mainly just considered a cost of doing business. These should be things that are assessed on all of these things that would qualify for a franchise fee. It seemed only right to do it, even though it's weird to do it to ourselves, which I think was why it was put on a potential deferral of 3 years and then an assessment there. But that was ultimately a summary of sort of how that discussion went at the PAC level.
So I'm not the only one that thought it was kind of weird.
Yeah.
It's not unique to McMinnville. Other municipalities do the same thing. When I was at Beaverton before this, we didn't have franchise fees, we had right-of-way fees, but they were the same thing. And our water, sewer, and storm utilities all paid those right-of-way fees as well.
Do you have a question?
One more question. So you said at the end of the 3 years of collecting, we'd have 650,000, but that means we've collected for 4 years, correct? Because that's $100,000 off.
The first year was 250.
Yes.
And so to start off with zero in there, we were concerned given the age of the system. And so we elected with the funding strategy to build it up quicker for that first year. So 250 plus 2 more years at 150, I believe was 6. So now I'm hearing myself, and that adds up to 550.
550 instead of 650 that's.
So I stand corrected. It was 250 for the first year, 150 for the second, and then it looks like at that point, we had funded the master plan, so we put more dollars into that contingency to get it to 650. So 250, then 150, then 250. All of this could be reworked. That was the initial funding strategy we had based off of the master plan time.
Okay, so the third year is actually 250.
You are correct, yes.
I misspoke earlier than when I said we get a month per year. It's a little different than that.
That makes sense.
It's okay. We're not mad at you.
All right. The other policy recommendation here was the committee recommended the stormwater utility provide assistance to low-income households. This is the same customers helping customers program through St. Vincent that we do with Mac Water and Light, and our wastewater fund does as well. They do a $20,000 a year match that goes to people can apply to St. Vincent if they're having issues paying their utility bills. This one's you.
All right. Single-family residential rate, so this was a heavily statistical analysis where we looked and we measured a statistical equivalent number of properties to determine what that impervious area would be appropriate as a median impervious amount for a typical residential unit. A lot of mumbo jumbo to say that the committee recommended that single-family residential unit be defined as 3,500 square feet, and it was based on statistical analysis. That's important later when you get to calculating some of the commercial stuff. Any questions on that?
I have a question, yes, if I may.
Yep.
Yes.
So if you're talking statistics, you have a statistically significant number. What was your sample size?
Ooh, I'm wondering if Christina can chime in.
I can answer that.
Thank you.
This is Christina Conchilla with Raftellus. Initially, when we measured the equivalent residential unit sample, it was 400 residential properties. We had some issues with some of them being outside of the city limits and in the urban growth area. And so we ended up with 385 within the city. But since that time, because of the tiering and the additional statistical analysis, we have measured 600 single-family residential properties. But that's a 95% confidence in that number. So
So I assume those were just distributed equally throughout the city to account for.
that is correct. So it's a completely random sample, but we do check to make sure that they're well distributed and represent a wide range of age of construction and different types of building and so yeah, it's a wide range throughout the city.
Thank you.
Mayor Jessica.
Yeah. Thank you. Just a moment. Counselor Payne?
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you for presenting also, James and Jeff. My only question is, does the impervious area on properties, particularly in town, include sidewalks? Because like, I allegedly own my driveway.
So it would
The street.
include private sidewalks. Sometimes people have sidewalk that go around their homes. It would not include the public sidewalk out by the street.
Thank you.
Tiered residential rate structure. This is the only recommendation that's been adjusted a little bit. And the
Adjusted as in different than what we presented in April of last year.
correct, and that's due because we have since then done some statistical analysis that Christina is going to touch on later. But essentially now we've reconvened with the committee, and they recommend adopting a tiered rate for single-family residential properties. And so you would have your median, and then you would say a certain number of properties. If you are less than that, then you would pay a reduced amount. And then for properties that were larger than that median amount, you'd pay a higher amount. But it's a way of trying to, again, apply the fee in a way that is based on how much impervious surface you contribute to the system with your property. In addition to not just being a flat storm rate that's applied to every property, we're trying to look at properties and split it up in a way that's consistent with how much measured area is really on your property. Any questions there?
How are you measuring that? I mean, are you doing it sky? I mean, how are you going to look and figure out how much is on each property?
I would like to save that to the later part
Okay.
where we're going to present on the tiered analysis,
Perfect.
but it's a real hoot. You're going to enjoy it. So,
We'll look forward to that.
okay.
Counselor Tukalski?
Thank you. Yeah, so when I was reading through the packet, it doesn't say anything about grandfathering anyone that already has impervious surfaces. And I'm sure that there would be choices made differently had people known about this style of, we'll call it a fee that could be incurred for more impervious surfaces. How was the grandfathering of existing properties discussed?
I don't think it necessarily was. The reality is if you have a lot of impervious surface on your property, you're contributing to the amount of flow that has to be handled by the infrastructure. And so I don't know if I can't recall us discussing ever a situation where we would grandfather folks in without contributing to the cost of managing that system.
I had one more question, if I may, Mayor.
Yes.
Some areas of town have their gutters completely draining into, I would say, a wetland, and they don't contribute to the street stormwater. How is that considered?
It was discussed pretty in depth, I'd say. And where we still arrived was you still use your vehicle to drive on public streets. You're still partaking in going down to 3rd Street and enjoying our downtown. So there's still, even if you aren't maybe directly discharging to the public's infrastructure, you're still getting benefit out of using the public infrastructure that has to be drained by a stormwater utility. It was discussed if, and we'll get to that one in a little bit, about potentially having a reduction in a fee, and we'll get to that one in a bit, but I don't believe the recommendation at this time is to include that reduction. That answer your question?
Yeah, it's good enough for now, and I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Anything else right now?
Counselor Payne has her hand up.
Counselor Payne?
Thank you. Sorry, the mics are kind of glitchy today. I have a question about impervious surface, and maybe this, James, goes to sort of the later on in the presentation. Is there, or is there going to be, a vehicle for tracking impervious changes to properties? Like, example, what if somebody decides to pave like an RV pad on their property? There's no, you don't have to go through a permit process now for that. So what does that look like?
Well, kind of two things. I depending on what you're putting on your property, if it's impervious, it would need to be captured, and if there is a permit for it, then it would trigger that to be looked at. If there's not a permit for it, I'm not sure necessarily how that would be captured, other than more of an annual kind of maintenance of the system and double checking or a reporting sort of a scenario. The other side of the coin is if you decided to one day remove impervious surface, you would want to at least get credit if that shifted you into a different tier. And so we would, again, need to have a process set up with the billing to be able to accommodate adjustments in the future, whether that's going up or down. But the details of that, I would say, have yet to be completely ironed out.
Mayor?
Counselor Cunningham?
If I remember correctly, in the paperwork, the packet, that there was an appeal process.
Yes.
So I'd assume that could be a part of that if you were
Yeah.
to be doing it, then the next year you could appeal the charge.
Yeah, absolutely. And that appeal process was intended for folks that maybe the calculation was done incorrectly. Then you have the ability to come and say, hey, I don't have that much impervious surface. This is what I have. But you could also use that as potentially a mechanism for revising impervious surface too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Who does that appeal? Would it be to your department, or where would that, if somebody were to appeal, what are you thinking?
Yeah, and again, that's actually another one that we're going to get to.
Ahead of the game.
We'll elaborate there. You guys are asking all the right questions. Okay.
Are you good?
No, but I'm going to listen.
Okay.
I do have another question, but you may answer it. I'll ask you now if you wish.
Anything on the single family or the tiered?
No.
So just explain the tiers to me. So small, medium, large, and that's based on just the square footage?
It's a calculated square footage, and it's rather than going out and measuring every single house in town, which would be extremely laborious. It's a statistical analysis based on information that's readily available. And
Which you're going to get to.
we're going to get to. You're going to love it, I swear.
So just based on this, it looks like it would cost a homeowner, based on just what I'm reading, and just tell me if I'm correct or not, somewhere between $100 to $300 a year in stormwater fees?
So it's,
If I take the lowest and the highest?
Yeah,
That sound about right?
yeah, per year.
I just want to make sure
You're
I'm
in the ballpark.
understanding that right.
Yep,
Okay, thank you.
yep.
Mayor, may I ask a question now?
Yes. Counselor?
So impervious surface is the total impervious surface divided by the square footage of the lot. So it's how much cannot absorb the water.
that's the.
Right.
That would be your density of impervious surface.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you have a lot that say, I'll just throw out a number here, say it's half an acre, but only a quarter of the acre is buildable because it may be a wetland, what does that do to your calculation? Are you including the entirety of that half acre or is
So-
it buildable square footage?
What we utilize is impervious surface, not impervious surface density, if that makes sense. So we're basing it on the amount of impervious surface, which would contribute to the runoff.
So regardless of the lot
Regardless
size?
of the lot size.
Okay, so
Right.
that's a different calculation then?
It is, yep.
Okay. That answers my question. Thank you.
So separate from single family, you will have multifamily, commercial, industrial, essentially all things non-single family residential. Those ones, we did calculate each one. We did measure. And so those are expressed as a, in ERUs, but say it was, if the ERU is 3,500 square feet, if you have a commercial lot that's 35,000, do 35,000 divided by 3,500, that's the number of ERUs they would pay. So again, it's a factor off of that residential unit, equivalent residential unit. And so given the wide variety of commercial or industrial type scenarios, those ones we felt it was necessary to actually measure. And so and that's what was expressed in the recommendation from the PAC. Any questions on that?
Of course there are.
Bring them at me.
So looking from commercial small to large, that's a big
Absolutely.
difference. Why?
Well, I think that what you're seeing, you must be referring to a later slide where it's laying out a potential scenario. There was assumed impervious surface with that small and large and saying it could be this or it could be that. That's just based on the amount of square footage that you could see in a small commercial application.
So this isn't just a
large
price
one.
sheet, this is.
Yeah, commercial wouldn't have
Correct.
a tiered rate. It would all be based on if an ERU is $10 a month and they have 10 ERUs, they'll pay $100 a month. If they have
Yep.
one ERU, they would only pay that $10 a month.
And it's a way of them paying a fair share compared with the residential part of town and what they pay.
So I think because you have a tiered rate for the residential, but after that, that's not a tiered option.
That
It's
is
a flat option.
That is
That's
correct.
why these read differently.
Yep.
Okay. So if I'm correct doing my math here, a small business could be charged like $1,500 a year?
Could be, yeah.
And a large one could be charged an additional $21,000 a year?
Potentially, if they're substantial in size, absolutely.
And so Cascade Steel, 50,000? I
I
mean,
would have to look at the amount of square foot we had in our, in the measurement. I can get back to you.
bit of a different
Yeah, they
own
have,
permit.
yes, and there is another recommendation we'll get to related to places that have their own DEQ permit. And Cascade Steel is one of those, as well as, I believe, the airport has one too. But yes, if you have a ton of impervious surface, you have that much more impact on the system. And the intent is to charge based on that impervious surface.
so, and I know Jeff and I talked about this before. Obviously, you had somebody from Cascade Steel on there and Peter Allen, which is great. I think that's on. Have we reached out, are you waiting for an approval, I think maybe, on stormwater fees? Or have we reached out to kind of discuss it with more of our businesses or with the Chamber of Commerce that represents a lot of businesses or economic vitality group that we have that we the city council on to talk to other, it's just looking at it from it's like a large charge. And
Yeah,
it'd be nice to have.
absolutely. We had we did have one community session. We've only had the one, and that was mostly attended by that was mostly just attended by residents. But we were not reaching out to talk with all the commercial and industrial customers more until we had a firmer direction from the council on if we were moving forward or not. There is still some lag time, even if the council said today, move forward, it will take us a while to pull together an ordinance and for it to start actually be able to bill for it. And I was going to talk about that in the next steps, but it wouldn't be happening tomorrow, even if you asked us to, because it's just
Okay.
not doable.
So if at some point, and I don't know what this council will decide, but if it did, could we make sure and do that? Make sure and
Absolutely.
reach out to the community?
Yeah, we were working with Noel and had a pretty robust community outreach plan for what we were going to be doing if the council decided to move forward with the utility fund.
And I think it could not necessarily have to cost too much through communication as to some of those organizations or service clubs that have business owners and residential, but businesses, their charge is a little bit higher. So, thank you.
Yeah, and it was discussed as being a substantial impact on the businesses, and it was talked about needing to give them enough of a heads up so they can incorporate it into their business plans as well. So that was talked about, and kind of dovetails into the next recommendation, which to further ease folks in to dealing with this new fee was to phase it in over that 3-year period. That's why we talk about that minimum amount, and then you have that would be phased in to that interim level amount, with the intent of giving folks a little bit of time to adjust. But yeah, as Jeff's talking about, you can also, it'll take time to implement it, and part of the outreaching and time to implement it can also be that heads up. Before this starts, we want to give so much time. That's all council policy decision there.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so some additional billing recommendations. The committee recommended that the city and McMinnville Water and Light properties not be billed for stormwater services. This is similar to what we do currently for water and wastewater. Those properties don't pay water and wastewater services, so the recommendation was the city properties and the Mac Water and Light properties do not pay the billing for the stormwater services. And then the committee also recommended that the city work with Mac Water and Light to incorporate stormwater utility billing into the monthly billing statements, similar to how we do for wastewater currently. Mac Water and Light does all the billing for us through their program. Something that the committee did not talk about, but is a staff recommendation, is that billing a stormwater utility would follow the same rules as the other utilities, and with regards to utility shutoffs. So right now, if you don't pay your utility bill, it triggers shutoffs through Mac Water and Light's process to get the bills paid. And so staff is recommending that council consider following that same process for stormwater.
Have you talked to Water and Light about that?
We have talked with Water and Light about that. It is a policy recommendation, though, so obviously the council, yeah.
It can be done. It is feasible, the intent was to be consistent with how we're already administrating the other utilities. And there was, I think for a while there, we had started that coordination with Water and Light to get the different properties ready for billing, doing the legwork for that. That's since then has paused till we've gotten the feedback from council to continue with this, but that will take about 6 months to get us up and going for that, and some of the details of how that's actually administered still would need to be ironed out, and this would be one of those details, I think, that would have to be really ironed out in that process.
I agree. I have a concern on shutting somebody's power and water off based on stormwater, especially in this day and age when people are struggling. And stormwater, I'm not going to say it's not important, but having your power on is super important. Yep. So I just, yeah.
completely
something
understand.
obviously discussed and hasn't been decided, but that's just, I have concerns about that.
Yes, understandable.
Yep.
Thank you.
That one's you too.
All right. So next, the committee recommended that the minimum billing impervious area for commercial, multifamily, they'd have to have a minimum of 500 square feet on the property before we do billing. So if you're at 499 square feet of impervious on the property, we just wouldn't bill the stormwater fee. But if you're at 501 square feet of impervious on the property, we would do billing. And then for ease, we don't bill in incremental ERUs. The recommendation from the committee is to bill by rounding up to the nearest whole ERU. So if you had a 501 square foot impervious area on your property for, the non-single family, you would be paying a whole ERU. Any questions?
So this is what was mentioned earlier a little bit with Cascade Steel. There's a unique scenario where there are some industries that will have their own stormwater permit from DEQ. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Those industries or commercial businesses already deal with detention and treatment to meet DEQ standards, just like the city would deal with that with our own infrastructure. We felt it necessary that even not to waive the fee because they still use the city infrastructure throughout the rest of town, but to give them a discount because they are already contributing to managing that stormwater before it reaches the Yamhill, essentially. So the committee recommended a 35% discount for those types of scenarios. It was also discussed pretty heavily about private systems that may not have a DEQ permit, but there's a substantial private system that is managed by, say, an HOA. The extent of how many private systems and the complexity of those is pretty far-reaching. So at this time, it is not recommended to give a discount for that. But it was recommended to, let's look into that further and consider it when we do our stormwater master plan, so we have better data available to make that decision. Any questions?
I do. I have two. I remember what my first one is. So let me just understand. So you're billing properties, considering billing properties on impervious space all through town. So in urbanized area. But if someone isn't using it at their house, we're still going to charge them something because they're using infrastructure, but isn't a business paying for that infrastructure? I mean, isn't every property paying for it? So are we?
So the
Twice?
impervious surface within the right-of-way, within the street, is not part of any of these calculations. You could almost consider it overhead, where everybody has to share in that cost because everyone gets to use the streets. Everyone gets the benefit of the street having a collection system that takes all the runoff that hits the street and then pipes it eventually to the Yamhill. And so that part is just because you may not contribute substantially from your property to the system, the fact that you may still be utilizing the streets within the city limits means that you should share in that burden of managing that system. And that was some of what was discussed.
Okay.
Is our rationale.
And also
Okay.
from the regulatory standpoint, we have the regulatory requirements because we're draining to the Yamhill. We're all draining to the Yamhill, so we all are sharing in that regulatory requirement.
And DEQ could care less if it's a ditch or a pipe or a small drainage way that goes to the Yamhill. If it's within the city limits, the city will be responsible. And so there's some of that management of the overall system too.
And then let's talk about the private ones, because we know that's come up multiple times. So let's just talk about the fourth edition that keeps coming up, and that they have their own stormwater system. So do they?
They do.
And how does it connect to the city in?
So it
Anyway.
discharges actually onto the golf course, and the golf course drains to a drainage way that goes through the city and eventually discharges to, I want to say it's the lower Cozine, which then discharges to the Amhill. That private system within Michael Book 4th edition was built as a private system. What's unique in Oregon is there is not, I would say, clear codified language with how to handle stormwater from property to property. It's more or less a series of case laws, which kind of referred to as Oregon drainage law. If you were to boil it down, you're not allowed to restrict your neighbor's property from draining as it did before. You're allowed to discharge water in the same fashion from your property if you have not substantially altered it. So if someone upstream builds a ton of impervious surface, that would be considered an alteration because they've increased the amount of stormwater flow leaving their site. They would have to do something like detention to hold it back and meter it out as it leaves. If you are downstream and you don't like your neighbor's water flowing onto your property, you're not allowed to dam it up or keep from accepting it because that could cause damage to your neighbor's property. So that it's a complex environment in Oregon to manage stormwater, but essentially what is happening in Michael Book 4th is there is public infrastructure upstream of them that does discharge in the same fashion as it did prior to Michael Book being developed, and that's some of their, I would say, to their point, they do manage public water and pass it through their system, and so if council wanted to look at that policy more, to whether a discount was given or not, that could be looked at. But it's a unique scenario there. We don't have very many private systems where public water discharges to them. That one is pretty unique. There are a couple throughout town though.
So if there's only a couple, maybe it's something that we should look at a little bit
Could be.
more before, if anything were to go into
Yeah.
play. I don't quite understand your explanation, and I don't think it's because you didn't explain it, it's just because I don't understand it.
There are a lot of private systems, and I'm still finding somewhere, oh, I didn't know that was a detention facility. And so even in 2.5 years of being here, we're still finding storm facilities. It's like, oh, that was built 50 years ago, and sure enough, it functions this way. I would say the amount of data we have currently in our public records that we manage here in engineering, I would say we have 50% of the stormwater information. And so I would be concerned about making a decision with only half the data, is the way I put it out there. And that's one of the reasons why we recommended that stormwater master plan, because part of that would be collecting more data and having a more informed decision.
I guess I also I see your point, but I also go, if we charge them and then find out that really they're managing it, they paid for something they didn't necessarily owe, I mean, so there's that kind of looking at it from both sides. So as to really, how do we look at that? So maybe you're smarter than I am. Maybe we could look at it and think of if there might be a way to be able to just relook at that, and maybe there isn't, but I would at least just like to think about it a little bit more as to how we do that, to be fair to the city, but also be fair to someone that might have an infrastructure that's working or partly working. So, did you have a question first? Okay, I'll be with you in just a minute, Chris, and we're going to go to Councilor Gary.
And if we're diving into it later, we can have this later, but if a neighborhood or a property of any size has their own private stormwater, has that historically meant that the city has no engagement and entanglement with it? Are they truly self-sustaining systems that require no interference from the city or time or burden to our up or downstream system?
Each system is unique. And so I don't know if I could answer so broadly, but I would say more often than not, if it's maintained and managed by an HOA, the HOA takes the majority of that burden. There are times when they are not properly maintained, where the city needs to step in and say, hey, you need to maintain this, or the city will maintain it, and we have to deal with trying to recover costs associated with that. That can be sometimes more administratively costly than actually just doing it, so the city hasn't always recovered costs. But yeah, broadly speaking, HOAs or private entities would manage the majority of the burden of that cost, I would say.
Okay. Thank you.
Counselor Chenoweth?
Thank you, Mayor. Did I hear you correctly say that for Michael Brook Fourth, some of our city water is going out through their system?
That is correct.
So I would add that to the need for some of this discussion, in that if they're providing service for us on top of paying for their own system, it would seem like in order to be equitable, we need to be reconsidering how we go about assessing a rate to them.
Absolutely. If that's council's discretion or direction, we can look at that.
And I will add that it's important contextual information to know that when it was built, it was the decision of the developer to have that system be a private system and still receive water from the city, because they did not want to build it to the city's standards at that time. So it's just.
Well, and that's fair, but if they're providing us a service by allowing our water to flow through their system that they're paying to maintain, it would seem like we would need to make sure in order to be just in how we're assessing this, that's part of the equation in the decision-making process.
The alternative argument could be that they're just maintaining compliance with Oregon drainage law. That water was allowed to be there before, and it's allowed to be there now. There's two ways you can look at it.
But when it comes to the charging, yes, it is information that we can consider, and if the council wants to have something more specific in an ordinance for that specific system, or a way to describe that system, that if it's a private system receiving public water or something like that, we can absolutely do a deeper dive if and when the council decides to move forward on creating an ordinance.
Well, and to be clear, I'm not trying, I want to make sure I'm not trying to imply that we should be, I mean, if the law requires that they have a connection, then obviously we don't necessarily need to be, quote unquote, paying them for that use of that connection. But on the other hand, they're maintaining a part of the system that allows us to to put water out. And so, and they're paying for their own system at the same time. So if they're providing us a service and they're paying for their own system of that section of the stormwater, it seems like that needs to be part of our calculus.
Counselor Tukalski?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. With respect to Michael Buck Golf Course, not 4th edition, it's 140 acres of heavily watered area. It could be considered permeable, impermeable by the amount of water that they do use. And the water's coming out of Miller Pond, which is out in Fox Ridge area. They bring a lot of water into the system, but it's dumped into the Cozine as wastewater. What have we considered is the impact on the golf course on the system, and how does that contribute, and are they being charged as well? Because that's not considered impervious surface.
They have measured impervious surface too, and they would be charged or assessed a fee based on the amount of impervious they have.
Right, but that's not, I'm talking about the 140-acre golf course, not just the clubhouse.
Correct.
The way the recommendation is now, they would not be paying for, the way the recommendation is now, they would not be paying for that pervious area.
Correct.
Now, if through the stormwater master plan process, it was determined that there was a larger impact from that golf course, I guess that could be looked at, but then it would have to be a decision by the council if we wanted to find a way to recoup costs for that impact. But right now, the golf course would only pay for its share of the impervious surface.
Yeah, and they actually, I believe the reservoir that's present there on the golf course, that the storm systems, that's the natural drainage path that was there prior. Essentially, they dammed up that drainage path. They use that as irrigation out there, and so there is some utilization of that stormwater that's coming down the line. I don't know how much. We have not dove in deep to figure out their impact on the system. We look downstream and we don't necessarily see hydromodification of the drainage way, and so they're not, from what I can tell, negatively impacting the system, and so it hasn't triggered any more of a response from me.
Okay, I was just curious about the golf course. Thank you.
So part of the stormwater fee would go towards street sweeping, leaf
Yes.
pickup, all that. Do we do that in the 4th edition? Do we offer those services to that area?
Not on private streets, and those are private streets, is my understanding.
So charging them full tilt stormwater when they're not getting everything that's paid for through stormwater would be something else I would want to consider.
Okay. Yeah, and while any of these are all recommendations, any one of these council can, have us dig into
Totally.
further, so. that's
Totally. It's just
absolutely
asking
something
the
that
question
can be
so
done.
we know what you thought. And I totally appreciate it.
Yeah.
We have a ton of questions, and
Oh,
don't think that it's personal or any of that. It's just,
Nope.
I am someone that asks a ton of questions, so.
Not a problem at
I
all.
appreciate you answering them all. You're doing a great job.
It'd
Thank
be
you.
weird if you didn't have a lot of questions.
Yeah,
This is a pretty big policy decision.
Okay, good, because you'll find, and Claudia can tell you, Jeff can tell you, I ask questions all the time.
Questions are great, not a problem. With the complexity of this potential fee, one of the things that was also discussed and we feel is very important is that opportunity to have that administrative appeal. We talked about it earlier, and this is a recommendation from the PAC, and this would be, we would have to have a formal process that, hey, if we measured your site incorrectly, you got to be able to approach us and have a process to where we can fix that as part of the billing. And that's all that recommendation is there.
So then the last recommendation from the PAC was that they recommended that an update to the 2009 Stormwater Master Plan be a high priority for the utility and that it be completed within that 3 years. So as we discussed, working from that minimum level to that interim level rate. And then at that time, hopefully we'll have a lot more information about our stormwater system, completed that other 50% that James was talking about, and would be able to come to the council with a recommendation. The rate looks good, the rate's too high, the rate's too low, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I would add to that by saying our 2009 master plan, it's very dated. It was much more, I would say, more of a broad study. And so that I would say it's not an appropriate assumption to believe that back in 2009, they had all the data. And so to have a current master plan that meets the needs for really managing this, we would definitely have to do a new one that would go more in depth.
How long do you think a master plan would take to put together?
Probably a couple years overall. A lot of that has to do with the data collection on the front end. It's just going to take time to go through and pour through the amount of information that we would need.
And Chris, I'll get to you in just one moment. If it takes 2 years for the master plan, if this were to go through, would you be waiting till that master plan was done to start the stormwater fee? Or would it happen prior?
No, it would be prior.
Prior so that you
because
can
the
pay for
fee has
the
to pay for
plan.
otherwise, the only dollars you could use to pay for the stormwater master plan would be general fund.
Counselor Chenoweth?
Thank you, Mayor. This is a squirrel, but popped into my brain, so I'll hit it now. How much have we spent to date for consultants on this process?
I would have to get back to you on that. I do not have that number available or ready. Sorry.
Please do. Thank you.
Yeah, my recollection is with all the statistical analysis and this additional tiered rate work, we're around 150,000, I want to say.
Okay, if you could get that number to me, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
And that came out of the general fund? Or is that ARPA funds?
Wastewater.
Anybody? Anybody?
It's a little complicated. The intent was that the stormwater fund, once it was established, would pay it back. The money was charged out of the wastewater fund. And as we discussed recently, that is not appropriate. And so we are hoping that it solves itself by a fee getting enacted, but if not, we're going to probably have to find a way to rectify that with general fund dollars, just being fully transparent.
The other thing I'd add to that is this committee that was set up, the PAC, is a dual purpose. It was for the stormwater utility fee as well as the wastewater analysis that's happening with the current wastewater conveyance and treatment master plan. And so trying to do multiple things with one committee and be efficient with the dollars. And so it was also used for some of the stormwater analysis.
I believe at the time, the idea was it was going to work similar to when the general fund does borrowing from the wastewater fund.
Thank God we had the wastewater fund.
Yes. But since the stormwater fund would be the one paying it back, it was left in the wastewater fund at the time, instead of being a transfer to the general fund and then paying for it. It was left in wastewater, I think is how it was set up. But like I said, we tried to get that cleaned up and make it out a little clearer with the council establishing, from accounting purposes, an actual stormwater fund moving forward.
Yeah, so if you can get us, the whole council, how much that is that has to be repaid back to the wastewater fund, please.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Perfect, because I want to know exactly what was borrowed from the wastewater fund in this process. That'd be great. Thank you.
Anybody else up here?
Okay, so that was the last of the PAC recommendations. Now we get to, I think James may have oversold the hoot aspect of this, but
I'm ready to be excited.
yeah.
Each their own, all right?
But
It was good stuff.
there's actual dollars that were put into the rate recommendation, and we wanted to go through a little bit with the council how that works. But we brought our consultants here to do that. The first part of that is establishing that revenue requirement. So when we were talking about about 2 million for the minimum first year, and then working up to about that 4 million interim number, what exactly is in that? So if you look in there, we have money for maintenance of the collection system. It starts a little bit on the low end with 100,000 and moves up to the 500,000. That's because we're going to, over time, have to hire staff to maintain that system. We're not going to be able to add that work just onto our existing conveyance team size. They are meant to take care of the wastewater system, so we're going to have to increase operations staff to maintain the collection system.
How many FTEs are you expecting?
Oh, gosh, I had that number. I want to say it is a supervisor and 3 more. It's either 3 or 4. Then from the operations, we talked about that LEAF program and the street sweeping, so that money being able to be covered. Right now, it's about that 440,000, and it's going to pick up a little bit more in there. The engineering number starts on the higher end, and that's because it's paying for the master planning work, and then it drops down to a lower number, and that's mostly to cover the regulatory requirements. Administrative services, that's just the stormwater utility then paying its fair share of finance director's time, finance's time, the city attorney's time, et cetera. As we discussed earlier, the franchise fee would start at 0 and then go up to that $240,000 number to hit the 6% after 3 years. And then from the capital side, the number is a little bit lower for infrastructure repair and replacement. That's about the dollar amount we would need for what we think are emergency repairs and just ones that are known, and then that number would get larger over time as the master plan is completed, and we have a better understanding of the amount of work we need to do. So that's how we determined the revenue that we needed overall for this minimum level and interim level, and that's what we could come up with without a full stormwater master plan.
Councilor Peralta?
And you may have already explained this, and I apologize if I missed it, but can you describe just briefly how you're differentiating between where you're at the minimum level versus the interim level?
Yeah, the minimum, and Deb, feel free to jump in here. The minimum is
I didn't hear that
essentially.
question. Can we have Councilor Peralta restate that in the microphone, please?
Yeah, can you just describe the differences in the levels that are attained when you get to minimum versus interim?
The minimum is essentially what we're doing today, minus the increase in cost of getting ready to fund the stormwater master plan. So your street sweeping, we do have some annual catch basin cleaning and some collections crew that goes out and do some annual maintenance on some of that stuff. That's essentially your costs there, plus a little bit tucked away for that emergency fund. And so the minimum is what we thought would be the absolute minimum you could get away with and cover your risks for dealing with repairs and build up some money to do that stormwater master plan. And then the interim then is after you've phased it in and you're completing that master plan. Then that's at that point where then you have a master plan that you can fully review. You know your list of upcoming projects. Then you can better develop a capital project list or a prioritization of which projects happen when, and develop what would come in the third part would be, a full utility fund, or I would say a better educated utility fund, because there's a lot of assumptions right now with interim. But that interim is after you've phased it in over a couple of years. We've made some assumptions as to what we believe is the right amount to have a fully operating utility. But until you have that full master plan, we left room for that as the final phase. If that makes sense.
Councilor Peralta?
Thanks. Just to follow up. So just to clarify, the minimum is essentially the current service level plus a few other things that we're not currently doing. And the interim would be after a franchise has been adopted. Do you have a rough guesstimate how much of the difference figure between the 2.4 million that we're roughly currently paying and the 4 million would be borne by the franchise? Would it be more than 1.6 million, or would it be about 1.6 million?
The proposed franchise utility rates cover all of it. They would cover all of the 4 million. That's what we're proposing here.
Yeah, and when we talk about what we're doing now at the minimum, really all we're doing now is that 100,000 and that 440,000 that are at the top. We are not working on that.
And a little bit in engineering too.
Yeah, a little bit, but we're not doing that big 1.1 million for master planning work. We're not doing any billing right now. We're not saving up any capital right now. So and the majority of that money is being paid for by the street fund through the gas tax. That 440,000 is mostly the repairs to the drainage system in the street and the street sweeping currently.
Yep.
Councilor, are you okay?
So yeah, we're
Councilor
not spending
Cunningham?
2.4 million currently.
No.
Yeah, before we were talking about the 650,000 that we needed to build up for 3 months worth of operational cost, is that a part of the capital then, the infrastructure, or is that, because I'm not seeing that a part of these numbers?
Yeah, so that's a different about, so when we talk about 3 months of operating, generally that's what it is going to take to cover the staffing, the maintenance you do over that time and what.
I'm familiar with, I understand that part of it. I'm just wondering, in these line items, where would that 250,000 the first year, 150,000 the second year, and then 250,000 fall?
Captured in the capital number.
Okay,
I
that's,
believe it's the capital.
yeah, that would make the most sense to me. May I ask one more question? Okay. And so what you just spoke about, the collection system at 105 and the operations at 440 and a little bit more of engineering coming out of the street fund. So obviously, in the creation of this utility, those monies would then live back in the street fund. So we potentially would have more money for, let's say, the Alpine Street, finishing that all off, because then we'd have that money available for that program.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Or keeping up with pavement restoration, yeah.
Like on First Street.
Pick a street.
Big street in the street.
Thank you.
Okay, Counselor Payne had a question, but she needs to pop off, so she sent me the question.
Okay.
When does the street sweep contract go to bid again?
Ooh, that's a good question.
So we have two contracts. I believe they're both up for renewal this year, but they're both, I believe, extending the current contract. I would think the citywide one goes out next year, but I'd have to double check
Yeah,
that.
we can double check.
follow up with her on that.
number.
If you can send the answer to all of us, or to Claudia to send all of us, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
And then, at some point, could someone calculate the initial and ongoing cost for the city to do its own street sweeping?
Absolutely. Our operations group has been looking into that already. They usually do when they get the numbers for that street sweeping contract. It's, the annual cost isn't too bad. It's usually just the staff time, but the capital cost of buying a street sweeper can be pretty expensive, and they're running 40 hours a week. You're putting a lot of hours on those engines, and you're basically they usually last about 5 years before you're going to have to replace them. So if you're spending, $500,000 on a street sweeper, you're going to have to spend that same $500,000 5 years from now. So you're going to be able to, ultimately ends up being like $100,000 a year cost.
Her last point is she's not necessarily happy with the current street sweep.
Understandable. So we could, I suppose, look at taking it on, and she could be not happy with us.
Are you, yeah, never mind. Counselor Tukalski.
Yeah, I had a question. So thank you, Mayor. We're talking about hiring 4 FTE to maintain this new utility. Was that what I heard?
Yes, for the collection system. So that's the staff time for creating essentially a stormwater utility crew.
Right. And so I see in Table 1, it's about $569,000 annually for that head count. Does that include PERS for those individuals?
Yes, it would include their salary and benefits.
What's that?
Yeah, the numbers we used were for salary and benefits for staff, and then equipment and some other things. There's a lot in there. We could get more specific breakdowns if anybody needs. 'Cause
I'm
it
just
was all
wondering,
calculated.
because this is coming off of Table 1, which is the minimum service level, and if it's $569,000 annually to include PERS, how are we covering that cost? Is that also out of the same utility fee?
Well, the existing cost for the staff time for the street crew, and then the conveyance crew's 10% time, that's covered in that gas tax number. It's paying its share of their PERS. But again, the majority of that, what we're spending now, is the $400,000 a year for the street sweeping contract. So there's so.
I understand, but so we have a street sweeping, maybe we're misunderstanding each other. You're talking about street sweeping. I'm just talking about people that are hired, new hires to the city when we're cutting staff at this time, that are going to be hired in order to maintain this utility. So we have street sweeping, and then we have these other people doing the work for the utility, is that correct?
Yeah, and the utility would pay their salary and their benefits, including PERS.
For both
So-
sections, for the street and for the storm collection?
Well, I guess yes, if the crew is allocated to do stormwater work, the stormwater utility would pay for that portion of their salary and their portion of their benefits. Similar to how our wastewater fee works now, wastewater rates pay for the wastewater staff's salary and benefits.
So from the packet, I see that the proposal puts us kind of in the middle of the stormwater fees with respect to other cities around the area that was, I would just say qualified.
Yes, we
Right.
get into that a little bit more
Yeah,
coming
we
up,
will.
but yes.
So my question is, how has it worked out for those cities to have this dedicated stormwater fee? And how does that compare to the fees that we're proposing to charge so that we can have a stormwater system, but also not, be detrimental to the other areas of our city, like the library or public works or police or anything like that?
I mean, I guess that's the overall policy discussion, right? Is we are talking about the recommendation to adopt a fee to take care of our existing infrastructure and the regulatory requirements. And from the council's point of view, you have to take that into account with all the additional other services the city has to provide. As far as how it has impacted other cities.
Yeah, I was curious, have you visited other cities to figure out how it's working for them since they've brought that in?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a very standard system. Like,
Said you had one in Beaverton, right?
we had one every city in Washington County has a stormwater utility fee, at least in the metro area of it. Clean Water Services covers that whole area, and they have a stormwater requirement on top of that. So I don't know of any city that's adopted a stormwater fee and then gotten rid of it afterward.
Yeah, and maybe this is one for Deb to chime in, because she has a lot of experience of working with other cities. But yeah, the majority of cities in Oregon, I would say that are over 10,000 have some sort of stormwater utility, just like the other utilities that they have. They're looking for a way to fund them. And even Monmouth, I think where I spend some time, there's 10,000 people. They have a stormwater utility, and it's relieved the burden on their streets. And we've seen more streets projects been able to happen. So I know they're happy with how that turned out. Anything to add, Deb?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, these are essential fees when there are the regulatory and maintenance requirements, and there's not enough revenue to fund the other city services. So it's absolutely true. They've been in place for decades in many places, and then there's continuing to have cities like McMinnville implementing these fees every year, particularly as the regulatory requirements are imposed.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know if they've been able to offset fees elsewhere to not be such a tax burden to the citizens?
Well, in some cases, like Salem, for example, that implemented a stormwater fee, I don't know, what was it, about 10 years ago, I think, James, right?
Yeah. I think so.
It was being paid out of the wastewater, the sewer rates. And so at that time, there was kind of a reduction made to the sewer rates as the stormwater fee was separated out as its own charge. And Woodburn is like that too. They pay for stormwater right now based out of the wastewater fund. So that is not an unusual practice, but more and more cities, as those costs increase, the costs specific to stormwater, they need to really be looked at as a separate charge out of fairness, as was said previously. Just because you're sewage flow and your sewage strength, designates what your wastewater charge is, that's not really a good indicator of what your impact on the stormwater system is. The impervious area is a much fairer way to do that.
Yeah, and if using Salem as an example, I think it was 2011 when they got a huge adjustment in their MS4 permit. So by 2014, they were implementing that. I think some of that separating from the wastewater was to help accommodate the accounting and make sure that they could adjust with that increasing regulatory environment. Obviously, they're ahead of McMinnville with that, but it's only a matter of time till McMinnville's in a similar situation where we'll have to be able to have our fees be adjustable depending on what regulation we're trying to meet.
So may I ask one more question? Have we considered a reduction in the sewer charge for folks that are?
So right now, I can't speak to how Salem or Woodburn's wastewater rates were put together and what was built into those rate models, but we don't have stormwater built into our wastewater rate model.
Correct.
So it seems like we're just continuing to ask for more from the citizens each time we need something new. And that's not any different.
That's one way to look at it, or it could be that this is an existing system that the citizens have never paid for, and we're at a point where we need to start maintaining it. So it's not something new as much as it's something that's been deferred a long time, and we're at a point where we need to start bringing that in.
And I understand that it's been deferred for a long time, but we have been paying for it out of the general fund. So either way, we're paying for it.
Well, yes and no, because the general fund hasn't been actually spending money to maintain the system. So
No, but it's an emergency fix.
yeah, only if it's an emergency. I only know a
Reactionary,
couple of
yeah,
those
exactly.
right now. And knowing the burden of the general fund, it's our recommendation to set one up in case a very significant infrastructure issue comes up. The general fund would not be able to.
Which it will.
It will at some point, yes. I don't know to what extent, but if you don't take care of it, something's going to happen.
Are there excuse me, Mayor, may I ask one more
Yes.
question? Are there contractors that we could hire in lieu of hiring full-time employees, to which we would have to pay PERS and we have to pay our health benefits? Are there contractors that do this style of work that would be more economical for the city to hire? And just have a single supervisor maybe to oversee the work?
I do not personally know of any cities that do that kind of that hire out that kind of work to contractors. Whether or not it's more economical, it'd be the same situation as what we've been talking about for the street sweeping. You'd have to do the math on it. But I don't know of any contractors that offer this service currently.
I think the sheer volume of infrastructure the city has probably justifies hiring staff. If you were to contract it all out, I would suspect it would be more expensive.
I'm just concerned
Yeah.
because PERS has a built-in increase every year, and that's what's basically breaking the budget of many cities. And that's the continuing challenge going forward. If contractors were more economical, that's why I was asking.
Understandable. And since this is a rate that the council sets, the rate can be increased over time to cover those increases. It doesn't have the same measure 5 and 50 restraints that a general fund would have.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Just a minute, I have a question first. I have 3 questions real quick. In your first year, so the minimum is the first year projection, does
That
that
is correct.
include the money that needs to be paid back?
Another great question. I believe
I
it
love it.
did.
I'm pretty sure, but
I can address that.
go for it,
Thank you.
Deb.
Yeah, so the way it was structured was to have $50,000 per year. Well, $50,000 was included in that. So depending on what the total is, I think that would be, generally, those kind of internal loans can be paid off over a few years. So I'm pretty sure that was what the assumption was, but I do know it was $50,000 in that that initial year.
Yeah, the spreadsheet James has up right now, and again, we can share this, shows 77,000 a year per year to pay that off.
Yeah, and this one might be a little dated because we've had to revise it several times, but it was shown as an interfund loan that would be reoccurring until it was paid back.
Did the council approve the intergovernmental loan at the time?
Believe that was discussed earlier on when we started up the contract to pursue this. I would have to go back and look. It was
Jeff, do you know
August
the
of
answer?
23.
Not to my knowledge.
So originally it wasn't contemplated as an interfund loan because the expectation was that it would only take a couple of years to stand the utility up, that wastewater could front the costs and then be paid back. So we've been tracking the costs separately, but it wasn't technically a loan. First of all, there was no entity to loan it to until you established a fund last week. So there wasn't a stormwater fund. So we were just tracking those stormwater costs in wastewater so we'd know what the new utility would have to pay back to wastewater. So it wasn't structured as a loan because money didn't change hands from one fund to another.
But the council was aware that money was
Yeah, it was
being
part of
spent
the
out of
budget. It was part of
wastewater
the
for
budget process.
stormwater?
Yeah, it was part of the budget process.
Budget process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my other, would you be hiring those 4 FTEs after you've earned enough money in that fund?
Correct. Yeah,
So
that minimum level does not include hiring them all.
It would be after the interim. Okay.
Yeah, once we're building up some as we're phasing it in.
Yeah, it would take some time, obviously, to hire them, to get them the equipment they need, all that.
And then my last question is, I know there's been some fees that were implemented that were on an automatic increase. Is
Like
that a
a-
proposal that your PAC is suggesting, or is it come to the council? Just a recommendation? Just
So the way this is set up, the recommendation would be that adopting ordinance set that minimum rate, and then the rate that would be the second year, and then the rate it would be the third year. After that, rate increases would come to the city council for approval, similar to what we're going to be doing for our wastewater rate here. A lot of places, and we don't do this, we don't set our wastewater rate as always like, an indexed number, or it's always going to
Like a CPI based on CPI.
Yeah, we do it we look at our number every 2 years, and then we recommend the increases for the 2 years. And then we look at it again, so we're making sure we're capturing what could be very expensive increases to chemicals or things like that, as well as what is our capital projection that's required. So it's, because the rate is paying for that operating cost as well as that capital cost. And so sometimes you have a very large project that's coming up, but it's not quite there yet, so you don't raise the rates until you need to, right? So.
Yeah, and
So right now, the PAC has no automatic recommendation for increases except for the 3 years.
Correct.
just the phasing.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say that would be a staff recommendation either. We'd model it similar to what we do with the wastewater fund and bring every rate increase to the city council for approval.
Perfect. Thank you. Counselor Cunningham?
Thank you. This is kind of be a statement and a question possibly for Vicky to answer in regards to Councilor Tukolsky's question on PERS impacting. It's my understanding that the big, very astronomical resets of PERS are driven specifically by Tier 1 and Tier 2 employees. And so these being hires now that would be technically fall underneath Tier 4, we wouldn't nearly see the fiscal impact that we currently do when it comes to
It would
those
depend
rate
on
resets.
the person's experience in Oregon PERS. So if a person had 25
correct.
years of
Thank you.
experience here and got hired on, they could still be a
Thank you.
2 or whatever person.
If after Mr. Towery retires, if we were to hire him, then we might have that impact.
Or my father-in-law.
Vicki, did you have something you'd like to add to that?
I was just going to add that technically it's Tier 3 or the OPSERT plan. To Jeff's point, it would really depend if they have prior PERS experience, what plan they come in on. But Yes, tier 1, tier 2 is kind of what's causing this increase in the PERS system. But regardless, the rates for OPSER are also going to continue to go up as we have more retirees. The PERS plan isn't expected to level out. I think it was 2045, Jeff, is that right? So this is just something we have to live with the PERS rates, regardless of the plan. It will continue to be that way until the tier 1, tier 2 retirees start to age out of the system. But I will say to your question, Tukolsky, Councilor Tukolsky, typically when you're hiring contractors, you're paying their base wage plus 30 to 50% regardless, and you end up having less oversight of the work that they're doing for you. So while we also have a 30 to 50, whatever your other payroll expenses are with PERS and benefits, it actually ends up not usually penciling out when you have full-time employees. And when you hire them directly, you have more control over the working conditions and the way that you ask them to work for you.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Anybody else? No? He's back. Counselor Chenoweth.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't know what the proper term would be or what the proper title is for you, Ms. Gallardi, but I would like to just say we may have to live with it, but we certainly don't have to like it. And what PERS is doing to every level of government, every level of institution. I mean, let's just be real. Part of the reason we're even having this discussion is because the general fund is so hampered that we're being forced to create more taxation to pay for PERS retirement. That's not fair to the citizens. It's not fair to the rest of the state as we continue to find more and more ways to take money from people to pay for the retirement of PERS. So, yeah, we may have to live with it, but we don't have to like it.
Thanks, Chris. And do you want to go on, or do you have your consultant?
So we're just about to hand it over to our consultant.
Okay.
But, so, basic rate calculation, we know the amount of dollars we need, 2 million to 4 million. We know the amount of impervious area we have, and so that's how we get to those ERU rate per month. But when we start looking at the tiered rates, it adds a little level of complexity. So I'm going to first pass over to Christina, who's going to talk about how we did that predictive modeling to figure out how the tiered system will work. And then Christina, as you go, just tell me when to change the slides.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. This discussion, again, is just talking about single-family residential properties. We have kind of already discussed that there's a little bit of a different rate structure on the commercial, industrial, and institutional side. So what was presented to you, I believe, last year in April was a flat rate for single-family residential customers. So this is, again, a single-family home. And the issue there is that, the smallest homes are paying sort of the same as the biggest homes in your community at one equivalent residential unit or one billing unit. And sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum is, measuring the impervious area similar to what we have done on the commercial, industrial, and institutional side for all of the single-family residential properties. But as James mentioned, that's a huge cost, and it's a lot of administrative burden on top of that to sort of maintain that data over time. So really, tiering strikes a nice balance between those two things. It does increase some equity in that single-family residential class, but doesn't quite have the excessive cost and administrative burden that measuring all the impervious area for all the single-family residentials in the community. And it does strike a balance, and it is sort of a more equitable option. So we highly recommend this option, and I'm going to kind of go through the steps that we took two-tier the properties because, as mentioned, we aren't going to measure the impervious area on all of them. As I said earlier, we've measured about 600. So if you can go to the next slide. So here we're talking about placing single-family residential properties into one of 3 tiers based upon predicted impervious area. So we have a low, middle, and high tier, and then those ERUs will be relative to the amount of impervious area within those different tiers. So I have some photos here, and I think someone asked earlier about like, well, how is impervious area, measured? So here you can see we do it on an aerial photograph. This is a pretty recent aerial image, and we measure the impervious area on a parcel basis. So again, we did 600 of these within the city of McMinnville. And if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's the methodology. So again, I've already mentioned we measured it on 600 single-family residential properties, and we do a statistical analysis called regression. And what that is it uses readily available parcel attribute data to try and predict impervious area to then predict where it falls into a tier. So here is some of the things that we used. We had some partial impervious area data from the city, partial being that it might be the building, but it doesn't have the driveway, or it has the building and the driveway, but it doesn't have a sidewalk or a patio or a shed. So it's only a partial impervious area set. It's missing a good bit of the data, but it's still a good predictor. Adjusted impervious area was a fee, a measurement that we calculated that was sort of the difference between measured impervious area that we did on the 600 and then that partial impervious area. Acres of the property, the number of floors, all of these attributes can be used to see how closely they correlate. So we did regression analysis on all of these sort of individually and in combination to see which of these attributes could most closely predict the amount of impervious area that was on the property. So because we have the 600, right, where we've measured, when we run this analysis, we can then say, run the prediction, and then say, okay, it was correct, it was incorrect, it placed it into the correct tier, or it didn't. So if you go to the next slide, please. We've looked at a wide variety of options, but the best option is this one here. And so this graph shows sort of the number of single-family residential parcels in that sample. And this is using the partial impervious area data and the number of floors. And then it puts about 15% of the single-family residential property into that lower tier, about 70% of the single-family residential properties into that middle tier, and about 15% into that higher tier. And you can see under the tier numbers the ERU that they would pay under those tiering scenarios. So again, under that flat rate option that you all saw before, everybody in this customer class would have been paying 1. Well, now we're saying the smaller homes are going to be paying 0.7. So again, if the rate was, $10 a month, they're only going to be paying 7. Okay, and then the largest homes are going to be paying 1.6 ERUs. And under this scenario, with this distribution and this percentage, we predicted it about 85.5% correct. And then the next numbers are how many were predicted into the incorrect high and how many were predicted incorrect low. And that's really important because we'd always rather our tier prediction do incorrect low. We'd rather it be take a home and guess its impervious area and put it into a lower tier because nobody was going to be upset that they're paying less. So we always want to lean on if it's going to be incorrect, we'd rather it be incorrect low and our percent incorrect high be a lower value. And again, in here, it's always important to remember that we are planning to have a customer abatement process. So if people do fall into those few percentages that are incorrect, they can certainly call the city and get it corrected and rectified. Even if we measured impervious area on every single family residential property, there's going to be some that are incorrect because we're obviously measuring impervious area on a static photograph aerial image. So it's never going to be 100% accurate no matter which option we choose. So, the 85.5% is very high accuracy as far as tiering prediction goes. So if you can go to the next slide, I can explain sort of some of where those breakpoints are. So tier 1, the smallest homes would be between 400 and 2,600 square feet. And then tier 2 is between 2,600 and 4,600. And then the tier 3 with the largest homes is those that are over that 4,600. And there's, again, those ERU values and how many parcels fall into those tier breakpoints, and then the total number of ERUs or billing units that go into that calculation that was just shown. And then you see adjusted ERUs, and that is there calculated because we did want to allow for some flexibility in that customer abatement process that people may say shift to a lower tier. So we wanted to have sort of a range here in the calculation. So that's what the adjusted ERUs are. Okay, so that's one option. But then, so we wanted to look at a second tiering option, which was to sort of adjust those breakpoints. Next slide, please. So this is looking at placing a larger amount of the single-family residential customers into that tier 1 and tier 3. So now in this option, there's about 25% in the lower tier and 25% in that higher tier and 50% in the middle tier. And as you can see in the table at the bottom, the accuracy here has gone down. And that's because that middle tier where most of the population lives, of the customers reside, has narrowed. And that's why the accuracy reduces, because most of the single family residential customers are in that middle tier. As you can see by the tall, blue line in the middle there. So when you sort of reduce the amount of people in that middle tier, it does tend to reduce your accuracy, which was why we had looked at option 1 as the preferred option, but I think they wanted one where there was a greater number of single-family residential customers in those sort of tier 1 and tier 3. So this one came out at 75.9% correct. And but a pretty high incorrect high. So 16.9% were predicted high, with 7.1% low. But again, good customer abatement process, you could be correcting some of those. So it's really just the council's preference of how many sort of customers they want to be within those various tiers. Next slide, please. And again, those breakpoints have adjusted to allow for the different percentages. So here our breakpoints are at 2,900 and 4,100. And the estimated ERUs and adjusted ERUs are there as well. If you go to the next slide. So this gives you the total ERU count for those 3 options. So obviously flat rate was what you all looked at last year, and then there's that tiered rate with the 15% the total number of ERUs, the adjusted ERUs, and then the 25, 50, 25 option. And I think that's it on my slides. Yep. I'm sure there's questions. So go ahead.
Councilor Cunningham?
Yeah, obviously when people are looking at these numbers, they'd go, "Oh, well, my house is only 1,600 square feet, so I'm gonna slide in tier 1 all day." Right. But I would assume, and I don't know if we have I would assume it'd also be a guesstimate of how much of a percentage of people's properties are actually impervious, like driveways and walkways and that type of thing. Because I would imagine that it ends up being a pretty significant number. Some people's driveways may be bigger than their actual houses.
Absolutely, absolutely, especially tending to be like the more rural parts of the city, on the outskirts. There's definitely some much longer driveways. I don't know what those percentages play out, but it will be important to communicate to people that it's not just the square footage of your home. And when people talk about the square footage of your home, a lot of times it's multiple floors too. So it's important to remember that as well, that it's not just the square footage of your home. It's any barns, sheds, driveways, walkways. It is the entire impervious area of your property.
Councilor Peralta?
Thank you, Mayor. Are there different costs associated with administering the different these different rates? Meaning, if you were to pick rate 1, where it's everybody's essentially on the same tier, is that less expensive for the city to administer than the other?
Absolutely. And that's where I was talking about the balance, right? That balance of administrative burden and the balance of equity. So obviously you're right, that flat rate, it's got a very low administrative burden, but the equity is sort of a little bit lower. So, and then if you measured impervious area on everything, that's very costly, because obviously the single family residential customer are the greatest number in the city. So there is a lot of them. And then you would have to maintain that on a regular basis. So you'd have to be updating those measurements quite regularly. And then this tiering sort of falls right in the middle. Where, you may want to update it every 5 years or something like that, but it's not quite as often as if you were doing everything based upon measured ERU.
Can I follow up?
Yes.
This is for, I'm not sure, Ms. Gallardi or Ms. Sheehan. The question that I have is, what are other cities that have adopted these doing? Are they mostly doing a single tier, or are they mostly doing multiple tiers? And do they have a process for, I think you were referring to it as an appeals process, but are these cities having some kind of appeals process where the homeowner can come in and say, no, I only have 1,200 square feet of permeable space, and how do they administer that?
Someone?
I think you said for Deb, but yeah, I think I can say that from my experience, and I've done, Deb may be able to speak more to Oregon, but I've done it all over the country, and it's really variable. Seems to be, I've implemented utilities both flat rate and tiered, but everywhere, regardless of flat rate or tier, there's always been a customer abatement process, whereby the customer, or appeals process, by which the customer can come in and because it is an impervious area based measurement, appeal their impervious area measurement. Deb, if you want to add more, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that based on national surveys, the incidence of utilities that charge based on tiers is higher nationally than it has been in Oregon. So we're, I'd say, a little bit behind the curve in terms of the number of utilities that have implemented tiered rates. I'll show you some examples from Eugene and Albany when we get to the comparison. Portland charges based on tiers, and Salem also. So there are definitely a handful of cities. Part of it has been some of the concern resistance has been concern over the administrative costs. But yes, everybody that has implemented it has also included some sort of appeals process.
Okay. I'm going to go to Councilor Tukalski and then Chris. Councilor Chenoweth, you'll be next.
Thank you, Mayor. Real quick general question. This Project Advisory Committee first met on October 16, 2023. Have you been a part of that since the beginning?
I have, yes.
Okay. Have our consultants as well?
Yes.
Okay. That's a general
Okay.
question.
And I got to give Chip Olstead credit. He was our city project manager that was working on it from the get-go. He's officially re-retiring this month, and so he's not here tonight, but he's done a tremendous amount of work. Was it 30 years ago? I think he was part of first implementing a stormwater utility fee in Corvallis. And so he brings a lot of knowledge with him, and we really appreciated his help.
A follow-up question. Inside of the packet, there was no equation showing how this is calculated, and equations are great. So what is the effect of multi-level buildings? Can you help us understand that? 'Cause if we're talking impervious
and I
area,
think-
should just be like a plan view, like looking straight down, but obviously that's not the case here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and the PAC had a similar question as like, well, if you're just measuring like horizontal impervious area, why is floors a good predictor? And, we can't exactly pinpoint the exact reason why some things correlate more strongly than others, but just from thinking about it is sort of like the more floors a home is, typically, the larger overall the home is. So, just in general, a larger, like a 2-story or 3-story, every case of more floors, the home sort of gets larger overall. And then you may have additional people that are parking in your driveway. And so just, I think the number of floors just generally tends to increase the amount of imperviousness on a property.
I'm going to somewhat disagree with that. With all the new homes that are going up in our town, they are not large, and they are 2-story.
Interesting.
So
That is
I
not
think we need
standard,
to keep that
but
in mind.
The data is, for some reason, says that it is. So
it's kind of the
is
dense
strongly
density.
correlating, because we did look at sort of partial impervious area on its own, but then when we added in the number of floors, it did more strongly predict the imperviousness for some reason. So.
Well, Mayor Morris beat me to the punch on that one, but yeah,
sorry.
That's fine. I also disagree with that portion, because these homes are very compact. They're two levels usually, and they have a driveway that accommodates maybe 2 vehicles, 2 sedans. So
Yeah.
I'd like to see your equation.
Them
If you could.
against kind of smaller, tiny, much older homes. Sort of over time, development has tended towards larger.
Are you willing to share your equation with us?
Absolutely. Do you want it right this moment? I'll have to
No, that's fine.
minimize the
You
screen,
have
but
my,
I would be happy to send it along.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Councilor Chenoweth.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to admit to being a little thick on this. I'm struggling understanding a piece here. It sounds like we keep going back and forth between we're going to be taking kind of averages based on some calculation to determine how much impervious surface there are, but then it sounds like we're saying, no, we're actually going to take real live measurements. That we're going to actually calculate the real measurement of the impervious area of the property. So help me understand what I missed in this discussion in my year and a half of hearing this, that I still am not clear as to which way this is going.
Right. So so the general idea for commercial, multifamily, industrial, we would measure the actual area, and we have measured the actual area. For residential, the model's predictive, but we had to do actual measurements to be able to get the model set up so it is hitting that higher 85% number.
Right.
So.
Okay, so on residential, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No.
Yeah. Sorry, we keep starting at the same time. We did measure a certain subset of 600, and that's to have a large number to check our prediction. So the 600 is measured to sort of check how accurate our prediction is. So sort of if you have we started with 400, but we added 200, and that just gives us more population to check the regression analysis to see how closely these values predict imperviousness.
So
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
residential is going to be based on some modeling where you're going to take, I'm going to guess, the square footage of the house as compared to the square footage of the property to determine, or how are you coming about where in this modeling it's going to fit? And let me just add my voice to the suspect of the numbers, because what we're seeing being pushed from the state is severe high density, which is multi-level jam-packed building. And so, and we're not impervious to those that requirement. So I'm, you know, while today that modeling may be accurate, if this continues, that modeling is not going to be accurate. So anyways, to my question.
Yeah. So we looked at a number of available property characteristics. The ones that most closely predicted imperviousness in the city were a partial IA set and then the number of floors. So those two in combination at a 15%, 70%, 15% breakpoint gave us that 85% accuracy. So those two property characteristics combined gave us the most accurate data. So it was a partial impervious area set and number of floors.
Okay, so let's take my house.
Okay.
Walk me through it with this, and maybe my thick brain will get this figured out. So I have a single story, 1,606 square foot home.
Mm-hmm. So,
What would you need?
so it's a statistical analysis called regression, and it is done in Microsoft Excel, and it gives you a value. So for, if you had 6, it gives you a value of how closely, it's called a correlation factor. So it gives you a number. And so then we would multiply that 1,600 of your house times that correlation factor. Then we would add that, and the floors would also have their own correlation factor. So it's a calculation of this factor times you know that your measurement of your impervious area times the correlation factor plus the number of floors times that correlation factor equals your predicted impervious area. Okay, so we do that for every property within every single family residential property within McMinnville. With the 600 that we've already measured, we can say, okay, we know that that your home is actually 2,000 square feet. Our prediction equation predicted it at 2,100, but you have to remember we don't need it to predict the imperviousness exactly. We need it to predict the tier accurately. So even though it may be, our prediction equation may be off by 100, it still predicted you into the correct tier. And because it's got, especially at those wider breakpoints, it's got a wide range. We know we predicted you accurately. Of the 600 we measure, we know how many we predicted accurately, how many we predicted inaccurately, how many predicted too high, how many predicted too low.
Okay, I think I got it now. Now I will echo my other counselor that I love that formula.
Okay, yep, and I can send you like there's graphs and all sorts of fun data, so I'm happy to send that along.
Thank you for
So
being patient with me as my
Thanks.
thick brain tried to figure.
No,
I'm right
I
there with Chris.
understand it's late, and I know nobody really wants to go back to statistics class.
So just help me, because I'm with Chris on understanding how
Okay.
you're going to do this, and we don't have to go through it all night, but if this goes into effect, are you seriously going to measure every house?
No.
Absolutely
No,
not.
you're going to use that
We're
prediction.
We're going to use data that's already available to us through public records to predict the tier they would fall into if
Are
we
you
were
going
to.
to look at every house, though? Or just look at their square footage?
So we already have that data available to us via county records. You can
Again, is that
export
data square footage of the house, or what's on that data?
So square footage of home and the partial, or there's the number of floors as well as the partial impervious area of that lot. Can you correct that one, Christine?
Yeah, so it's a partial impervious area data, so it can be really variable. The county at some point has some amount of impervious area data, so it's not necessarily the full square footage of the house. It's just similar to those yellow the maps and photos I had earlier, someone in the county produced some partial amount of impervious area data for most of the properties in McMinnville, or probably in the county. So we do have some partial impervious area data. It's not 100% accurate. It doesn't include all the imperviousness on the site, but it does have some amount of the impervious area on almost every single-family residence in McMinnville.
And they go back to
that's
like,
from the county. So that's county data, and they obviously, have provided it as public data. And then the number of floors.
and that
We also
data,
used a bunch of other types of available data, and just to see how closely they would predict. But these are the two in combination that most strongly predict accurately.
and that data is tied back to building permits. And
Yeah,
so
I
if
believe
someone
so.
were to build this house, there's some of that data already in the system for that property. And that's why we would try to set up this as a predictive way to administer what tier they fall into without having to physically go and measure every property to save that administration cost.
Yeah.
And when new
but
construction
you'd be
happens,
right in saying that, it can slightly change over time. So again, you may have to update the equation every 5 years or so, but that's still much less than if you measured everything, the amount of updates you would need to do if you measured everything and did everything based upon measured impervious area. That would require much more frequent updates.
thank you. Just want to make sure that if this goes through, that you have a fair budget for abatement hearings, because I have a feeling there will be a fair amount, because it's confusing.
It is.
And I think you're probably going to be super busy. So-
Yeah, and I would suggest that we even develop a procedure or a process and
Absolutely,
we have another
prior.
conversation about, hey, this is what we recommend as that. And we've had thoughts about how we would implement that with our JS program, so people could visually see, what is my property, what are they looking at, so we can be on the same page with that. But that would be next phase, part of implementing.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's move on, because we
Yep.
don't want to be
The
here.
very reason
all
why
night.
a lot of cities just go with a flat rate, and then they deal with the issue of everybody's charged the same. So you have to find the balance somewhere.
Gotcha. For you?
Yes,
You
please.
have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh, Counselor Geary.
Remind me again, the total amount of single-family residents that we have? So
22,000.
22,000. Thank you. No, I know.
So now-
Sorry, you said single-family residents?
The-
Residential customers, that's about 9,500 parcels, I think.
Sorry, that's the total number of ERUs.
Yeah, the
22,000.
22,000 is total ERUs.
Thank you, Deb. That would include all the industrial and commercial and everything too.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Did that answer your question, Counselor?
Yes.
Okay, great.
This is why we hired Deb.
All right.
Did you, hi, math. Were there any other questions before we get back to this?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Go for it, Deb.
So this slide you've seen before, and it does show that the basic math is pretty simple. We take the revenue requirements that we've been talking about, the 2 to 4 million minimum versus the interim, divided by the number of equivalent residential units, or ERUs, that Christina talked about, and that produces a rate per month per ERU. The devil is in the details, as we've been discussing, about how you determine what factor of an ERU you are under a tiered structure, and then measuring the impervious area and determining ERUs on an individual parcel level for everybody else. Based on the numbers that we've been talking about this evening, the rate per ERU per month is about $9, a little over $9 under the minimum service level, and about $15 per month under the interim service level. That slight difference is just because under the different tiered options, there's a slight difference in the number of total ERUs. Next slide. So this table just then takes that for the residential and shows you under a flat rate option and then the two tiered options, what that translates into rates on either end of the scale. So under the flat rates, everybody just pays the same one uniform volume or uniform amount per month, no matter what the size. Then under option 2, which was that 15/70/15 option that had the higher accuracy rate, the range under the minimum service level is $6.40 to $14.60. And the small tier, that first tier, includes 400 up to 2,600. Under option 3, there's a more narrow range. It's $6.45 up to $12.85, because the thresholds of those tiers are slightly different. You've got a wider range for tier 1, and then tier 3 is everything over 4,100 instead of 4,600, so it's a slightly lower rate. And you can see that how those ranges are under the interim level of service as well. So it's basically just taking the ERU rate and multiplying it by that factor that Christina was talking about. Next slide, we can look at the bills then for non-single family residential. As was discussed, everybody else is based on measured impervious area for their parcel, and that includes multi-unit apartment complexes. So the determination of the bill is you determine the impervious area, and there are some samples shown here in this table. You divide by 3,500 square feet per ERU, and that tells you how many ERUs each parcel has. And then you multiply that by the cost per ERU, and I've just shown it here for option 1, which is that flat rate. Either of the other options, it doesn't deviate within 100 or within 1%. So basically, we're talking about cents, not dollars difference, and it's just because that rate per ERU is slightly different under the 3 options. So you can see that for an apartment complex that's shown here that represents 27 ERUs, and these are monthly bills, that it would be about close to $250 per month under that option, and would potentially increase to about $413 under the interim level of service, which isn't anticipated for some time. Commercial is shown here, small, large, and those bills, again, these are monthly, $73 per month, a little over $1,000 per month. And certainly if you look at a large industrial customer, then in this case, the example shown here is 275 ERUs, and so that bill per month is about $2,500 under the minimum level of service. Next slide.
Sorry.
Yeah. Councilor Cunningham?
The multi-unit apartment complex, 94,500. Approximately how many units would be in that example? Because I'd assume that the $248 up to $413 would then be shared. The apartment owner would share that along to every single one of those units. That would give us a better idea of what an individual unit would probably end up having passed through to them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I didn't put this sample together, so I don't know what this particular complex was. Generally, we find, well, like with the attached single family type units, we find that those are about 0.7 ERUs on average. Mm-hmm. My guess is, when we start talking about higher density housing, that it's probably even lower, that each unit would be, charged a fraction of what the ERU rate is when you take that total and you divide it by the number of units. But I'm sure we can, get that information if this was based on a specific example from the city, or we can run a couple other examples.
Yeah, I think that would be a really good thing to know, honestly. Like, if we're trying to, get folks to understand this, if clearly there's the people that are in the detached homes, but there's a huge amount of the public that is in multi-unit apartment complexes that would still be paying in, just like everybody else. But if they're only paying the fraction of that ERU, they potentially would be below that initial tier in total cost. So potentially less than $6 a month for each one of those apartment complexes. But it'd be.
Yeah, looking at this example, if there was if each unit was 0.7 ERUs, using these numbers, each unit is paying about $6.50 per month, is what that 250 as it would factor down. If like what Deb said, if it's even lesser factor, it would reduce it even further.
Yeah.
I have a question on that same, so we talked about low income. So what about apartments that are housing authority or habitat? Are those getting the stormwater fees, or are those part of what you're talking about in regards to low income discounts?
Those would be paying the stormwater fees. Those low income discounts, people apply to those through St. Vincent, so I think they would be still able to do that, but we wouldn't be like automatically having a reduction in the rate.
Okay.
Correct, yeah.
And did you say originally that the schools were exempt from stormwater?
No, the schools would be paying. It was just the backwater and light properties and the city properties that were exempt. So the institutional number on there, schools would fall like under an example as institutional.
And that would be per building that they have, or actually it's size of their property?
Yeah, so we have to bill based on how backwater and light bills. So if they bill to that property, it would be there, and if it was a bill that's just sent to the school district, it would just have to get captured in that.
But it would be each one of their properties would be charged, but
Yes.
whoever, I don't care who pays the bill, but just
Yeah.
on all of those, so.
Yep.
Okay.
Mayor, may I ask a question?
Yes,
Does that
Councilor
also
Tchaikovsky.
include the county buildings as well? They're using backwater and light, are they going to also be charged?
Yeah, they're not exempt from paying wastewater or water, so the county buildings would be paying the stormwater fee.
Thank you.
Any other? Okay.
Okay. This slide just shows you a comparison based on some available information that we had published, believe by the League of Oregon Cities. And it does not represent all of the cities that charge stormwater rates. But it does, I think, give you a good idea of the range of the fees. So you can see here that the low is about $6 per month and the highest is over $30 a month. These, of course, it's really hard to do apples to apples comparison because of all the different regulatory requirements, the different types of, the population, all of the unique circumstances. Some of these are regional systems. So there's a single rate that's charged to all the different cities that are served, like in Clean Water Services. But then in some cases, the local cities will tack on their own local component. So there's a lot of variation here, but it does give you an idea of what other cities across the state are charging for stormwater fees for a typical residential dwelling.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so the orange column on the left is where the rate would land in that minimum starting point, and the orange column more toward the middle is what it would be at the interim point. These numbers that we got, that data is at least a year, if not 2 years old at this point. So almost all of these fees that are listed have gone up. So I was actually talking with Councilor Cunningham, or emailing back and forth on this earlier today. So like the West Lynn fee has gone up. So that orange column has actually shifted now because we haven't increased what we're proposing for our numbers since we first looked at this. So we're still about the same area, but not in the exact spots now.
Yeah, for instance, Gresham is actually, I should have just pulled it up. Gresham is now above that for 1530. I believe some of these numbers came from 2021.
Yeah, so it's, in the interim, level of service is not anticipated for some years, and as you said, there's been change already, there will be change, a lot of them change at the beginning of the fiscal year, so July 1, there'll be more increases. Yeah, it's just a snapshot in time. If we go to the next slide, we can look at some of the cities that charge the tiered rates. And again, it's Albany, Salem, Eugene in this example. There's some important differences in the rate structure, though, beyond just the tiers. Certainly, the number of tiers is pretty typical to be 3 for our Oregon communities. Eugene actually measures homes that are larger than 3,000 square feet. So they do a combination of the predicting the tier, like Christina was describing, and then actually measuring the larger homes. All of these other cities have a minimum charge or a uniform base charge, and then a scalable part of the fee. So actually the range of fees, with the exception of Eugene and its individualized charges for the larger homes, they're less of a range than what is proposed here under options 2 and 3, which is a 100% scalable fee, right? So everything is based on the impervious area relative to that average ERU. So it varies. Salem has a very high fixed base amount, and then I don't remember exactly what percentage of the total fee, but then the component that is larger, depending on your tier, larger or smaller, is only a portion of the fee. So you can see that, and this just shows 3 different size homes, a 1,500 square feet, 2,800 square feet, and a 4,800 square feet, and how, and actually I should say it's the size in terms of impervious area and where you would fall in the tier. So McMinnville minimum level of service is the brightest, the darkest blue on the lower left-hand side. The orange, the darker orange, is under the interim level of service. And so you can see that in comparison, both the interim and the minimum are the lowest of the comparative cities for the first 2 square feet examples. But then when we get to the 4,800 square feet, because so much of it is scaled in terms of the rate structure that we've presented tonight, it's actually, the interim level of service is actually higher than the Albany rate and the Salem rate. Now, again, this is looking at today, when we know that Albany and Salem's rates will continue to increase before McMinnville ever, gets to that interim level of service. So whether that would actually ever be the case is yet to be seen, but just to understand how the rate structure itself can also impact the relative differences in the fees. If we go to the next slide, it just shows option 3. And in this case, because the tier thresholds have changed, the 2,800 square feet actually falls in the first tier and is charged a lower rate. That's that middle section. So now both the orange bar actually went down slightly compared to option 2. But you still see the same impacts of the largest homes based on the dollars today are the orange bar is slightly above the Albany rate, but now in this case, because that under option 3, the highest tier rate goes down, it is under, just below the Salem rate. So it just gives you a little sense when we look at the tiered rates, how these rates that we've calculated compare. And I think that's the end of my presentation. If there's any questions, or turn it back to Jeff to talk about next steps.
So any questions before we go on to wrap us up?
Sorry, we were just comparing rates to cities that are more our size than Salem, Eugene, which are larger. So just
Yes, that's,
nice to have a comparison that's more in line with us.
yeah, I think it's partly because there's cities our size aren't necessarily doing the tiered rate structure because the administrative burden, they're just sticking with the flat rates.
Gotcha. Thank you. Any other questions from the council before they go ahead?
All right, so that wraps up the PAC recommendations and how the rate, the recommended rate was developed. Also want to add that the staff recommendation is also to adopt a stormwater utility fee to be able to cover our regulatory compliance requirements and to support ongoing maintenance of our infrastructure. But we've completed the work that was given to us at council direction for looking at this. So at this point, we are unable to proceed without further council direction. Should the council choose to move forward, the next step would be drafting creating a draft ordinance and then working with the council through all these policy recommendations to make sure that ordinance meets all the needs of what the council wants to see. And then we would finalize from there. But since this is just a work session, we're not looking for formal direction tonight. We're not asking for that, but we also wanted to make sure you had this information as you have your ongoing budget discussions over the next couple of months, because it is a significant dollar amount and part of the city's responsibilities moving forward. So with that, unless there's any other informal feedback you want to
I do have one more question. So you have the 2009 master plan.
That is correct.
Has any additional work to that master plan? Have you guys been working on that during this process? No.
No.
You do think it'll take 3 years to finish that master plan?
We'd use information we have,
Yeah.
but we'd be kind of starting a new master plan. And also that one was never adopted by the city council. It's only been in draft form since 2009.
It would take, 6 months to a year just to gather the data we need on our system, and at least a year to go through the whole process of developing the standards and the master plan. It's difficult to project how long, because we don't know how many projects would result from gathering all that data. And so it's a little bit of a moving target, but I'd say 2 to 3 years would be appropriate assumption.
Yeah, our wastewater master plan's going to take about, when it's all done, about 18 months. The TSP for the transportation one, that's going to take a couple years. That's just kind of how long these take, unfortunately.
Any additional questions from the council? Nothing online? All right. You have anything else to add? Are we done?
I don't have anything to add. You mentioned.
Okay, I will now adjourn the work session at 8:27.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you guys very much for answering all of our massive questions.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate it.